The world is stuck in traffic. From New York to Tokyo, highways groan under endless lines of cars, horns blaring, tempers flaring. But in one corner of Africa, a small nation has just leapt ahead of everyone else. Rwanda, a country that only 3 decades ago was written off by many, has now shocked the aviation industry by launching the continent's first public test of a flying taxi. Yes, you heard that right. While the rest of the world debates regulations and dreams of futuristic cities, Kigali has already taken to the skies. The scene unfolded at Aviation Africa 2025 in the Rwandan capital. Crowds looked up in awe as the E-Hang A216s, a fully electric self-flying passenger drone, rose quietly into the air, carrying with it not just 2 seats, but an entire continent's ambitions. In that moment, Rwanda declared to the world, Africa is not just participating in the future, it is leading it. But here's the bigger question. Why Rwanda? Why not the United States with its trillion-dollar tech giants? Why not Germany or Japan with their world-renowned engineering? What did Rwanda do differently that allowed it to skip years of delay and hesitation? The answer is not just about technology, it is about vision, the kind of bold, uncompromising vision we are now beginning to see across Africa. Look at Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré. Just as Rwanda is redefining the future of air travel, Traore is redefining sovereignty itself, nationalizing resources, building new infrastructure, and proving that Africa does not need permission from the West to chart its own course. 2 nations, 2 leaders, one message: the age of waiting is over. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear is not just a story about Rwanda's flying taxis, it's about the spirit of a rising Africa. Do you think you would trust your life to a pilotless flying taxi? And more importantly, can you trust bold leaders like Ibrahim Traoré to carry Africa into a new century of independence and innovation? If you believe Africa deserves to lead, hit that like button and subscribe, because the truth about Africa's future is more important than yesterday's headlines. The morning sun rose over Kigali with a sense of anticipation few cities ever experience. At the heart of Aviation Africa 2025, a quiet hum broke through the chatter of journalists, engineers, and government officials. Then, almost silently, the E-Hang A216s flying taxi lifted off the ground. In seconds, Rwanda had not only made history, but also sent a shockwave through the global aviation industry. This was no ordinary aircraft. The A216s is a fully electric autonomous passenger drone designed to operate without a pilot. With space for 2 passengers, 16 rotors arranged in a coaxial double design, and a cruising speed of 130 kilometers per hour, it represents the kind of leap forward many nations are still only dreaming about. The numbers are astonishing: a 35-kilometer range on a single-charge triple redundancy flight control systems and distributed propulsion technology that allows the craft to remain airborne even if multiple motors fail. What normally takes a 45-minute drive through Kigali's traffic was reduced to just 5 minutes of flight. For the audience on the ground, it wasn't simply a demonstration of engineering. It was a statement of intent. Rwanda was telling the world, we are no longer catching up, we are setting the pace. The symbolism was undeniable. From being one of the poorest nations in the world just 30 years ago, Rwanda now stood as the first African country to put a flying taxi into its skies. But the event was not just about technical specifications. It was about economics and access. Traditional helicopters cost between $1.5 million and $15 million, and operating them can run $200 and $500 per trip. By contrast, the A216s, with a suggested retail price of around $410,000, opens the door to affordable short-range aviation. Analysts estimate that when scaled, rides could cost as little as $20 or $50 per passenger. Suddenly, futuristic air mobility was no longer a fantasy. For the wealthy elite, it was a pathway to transform urban and regional transport across Africa. Safety, often the biggest public concern, was also addressed with groundbreaking design. Each of the 16 motors functions independently, backed by smart battery systems with 12 independent packs. Even in the unlikely event of multiple failures, the aircraft is engineered to land safely. Real-time monitoring, automatic emergency landing, and advanced redundancy make it arguably safer than most commercial flights. To a continent where road accidents claim hundreds of thousands of lives annually, this promise of safety is more than a technical detail, it's a matter of survival. The demonstration was also a showcase of Rwanda's regulatory foresight. While Western agencies like the FAA in the United States often take years to approve new aviation technologies, Rwanda built a framework that allowed this test to happen in months. It was the culmination of nearly a decade of investments in drone delivery services, infrastructure, and policy design. Rwanda has been using drones to deliver blood and vaccines since 2016, reaching remote hospitals in minutes instead of hours. By the time the flying taxi took to the skies, the public was already familiar with the idea of autonomous aircraft, and then came the political message, subtle but unmistakable. President Paul Kagame's administration positioned the flight not just as a technological first, but as part of a continental vision. Africa will not wait for the world to bring progress. Africa will build it here for itself. This is where Rwanda's story intersects with that of Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré. Just as Rwanda is building air mobility from scratch, Traore is rewriting the rules of sovereignty by nationalizing gold, investing in agriculture, and creating indigenous industries. Both leaders understand a central truth: the future belongs to those who act boldly, not those who wait. The Kigali demonstration was not a stunt. It was step one in a long-term roadmap toward a fully integrated urban air mobility network. Charging infrastructure, landing pads, and regulatory ecosystems are already being designed. And Rwanda, once dismissed as a small, landlocked nation, has declared itself the hub where Africa's aviation revolution begins. For the thousands watching in Aviation Africa 2025, the takeoff lasted only minutes. But in those minutes, Africa had crossed a threshold. Rwanda's flying taxi was more than an aircraft. It was a promise that a continent often seen as behind could in fact lead. The moment of climax arrived as the E-Hang A216s hovered steadily above the Kigali skies. Cameras flashed, drones filmed from every angle, and the crowd erupted in applause. For the first time in history, an African nation had not only tested, but successfully demonstrated a self-flying taxi in front of the world. The symbolism was overwhelming. Rwanda, once synonymous with tragedy, now stood as a pioneer of futuristic aviation. The reaction in the crowd was electric. Diplomats exchanged knowing glances, investors whispered about market opportunities, and ordinary citizens stared with wide-eyed wonder. The mayor of Kigali described it as a turning point in African urban life. International observers noted that the event felt less like a demonstration and more like a declaration of sovereignty. Rwanda was announcing to the world that it would not be a follower, but a leader. But the real story lay in the question everyone was asking: why Rwanda? Why not New York, where billions are spent on transportation research? Why not Tokyo, famous for its cutting-edge tech? Why not Dubai, which brands itself as a city of the future? The answer shocked many. Rwanda was chosen precisely because it had built something most larger nations had failed to achieve: regulatory agility and public trust in new technology. Since 2016, Rwanda had already normalized the use of autonomous aircraft through its groundbreaking drone delivery program. Blood supplies, vaccines, and medicines were dispatched to remote hospitals within minutes, saving countless lives. By 2021, over 75% of blood deliveries outside Kigali were made by drones, a record no developed nation could match. While the United States was still debating the safety of drone package delivery, Rwanda was saving lives daily. This history created a culture where people trusted machines in the sky, laying the foundation for public acceptance of flying taxis. The climax of the Kigali demonstration was therefore more than just technical. It was cultural and political. Rwanda was showing that even in the face of mountainous geography, limited resources, and a painful past, it could leapfrog traditional infrastructure and embrace the future faster than the so-called developed world. International reactions reflected this shock. African media outlets hailed Rwanda as a continental trailblazer, praising the nation's ability to turn obstacles into opportunities. Headlines read, "Kigali leads, Africa into the skies." Western coverage was more subdued, with some outlets acknowledging the achievement, but framing it as a Chinese-backed experiment rather than an African innovation. Still, the symbolism could not be ignored. Rwanda had beaten the giants to the punch. China, through its E-Hang partnership, emphasized why Rwanda was the ideal choice: progressive aviation laws, strict but fast-moving safety standards, and a government willing to support innovation rather than stifle it. At this point, the story naturally linked to a wider African awakening. Observers drew comparisons with Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré. In Ouagadougou, Traore had shocked the world with moves like nationalizing gold mines and pushing for local manufacturing. In Kigali, Rwanda shocked the world with a flying taxi. Together, these moments carried a shared message: Africa is no longer asking for permission. It is charting its own destiny. For many Africans, the image of Rwanda's flying taxi rising into the sky echoed the speeches of leaders like Traore, who declared that Africa's future would be built by Africans, not dictated by outsiders. Both stories, one technological, the other political, met at a single point of truth: bold action changes the narrative. And yet not everyone welcomed this development with open arms. In Western capitals, murmurs of concern grew. Could African nations truly regulate such advanced technology safely? Was China's involvement a threat to established aviation markets? These questions hinted at unease, even fear that Africa's role in global innovation was shifting from consumer to first mover. But in Kigali on that historic day, the applause drowned out the doubts. The flying taxi had not only lifted passengers into the air, it had lifted Africa's imagination. The climax of the event was not just the drone's steady flight, but the realization that the continent's future might unfold differently than anyone had predicted. The immediate aftermath of Rwanda's flying taxi demonstration was not just measured in applause or headlines. Its real impact began to ripple through society and politics in ways that few had anticipated. For ordinary citizens of Kigali, the sight of a self-flying taxi overhead was both thrilling and reassuring. They had already trusted drones to deliver blood and medicine. Now they could imagine stepping into one themselves. In a city where daily commutes can eat away hours of precious time, the promise of a 5-minute flight instead of a 45-minute traffic jam carried a sense of liberation. On the civil front, the potential benefits are profound. Flying taxis could dramatically cut travel times, reduce traffic congestion, and even lower road accidents, a silent epidemic in Africa that claims hundreds of thousands of lives each year. Urban mobility would no longer be defined by clogged streets, but by access to vertical routes in the sky. Rural communities, often isolated by poor roads, could be connected to urban centers with unprecedented speed. Imagine a farmer in the countryside reaching Kigali's markets in minutes rather than hours, or a pregnant mother in a remote village being flown to a hospital before complications became fatal. These scenarios are no longer science fiction. They are practical realities on the horizon. Economically, the implications are equally striking. The flying taxi industry promises to create thousands of jobs in engineering, maintenance operations, and air traffic management. Rwanda, by positioning itself as the hub for this technology, could anchor a billion-dollar industry in East Africa. Local universities are already adapting their curricula to include courses on drone technology, electrical engineering, and aviation law, ensuring that young Rwandans will not only consume this technology but also master it. This shift represents a conscious effort to keep value creation within the continent rather than outsourcing it abroad. Politically, Rwanda's achievement carries symbolic weight. A country once remembered for division and violence has rebranded itself as a model of order, innovation, and foresight. The successful test flight became a tool of soft power, projecting Rwanda as a reliable partner for investors and innovators. It also sent a signal to other African governments: leadership in the 21st century is not about who has the largest GDP, but about who dares to take the boldest steps. This is where the connection to Burkina Faso and President Ibrahim Traoré becomes clear. Just as Rwanda has defied expectations in aviation, Traoré has done the same in governance and sovereignty. By nationalizing gold resources, cutting foreign dependency, and launching ambitious infrastructure projects, Traoré has shown that African nations can dictate their own economic terms. Both stories, though unfolding in different sectors, reflect the same principle: true independence comes from action, not permission. Of course, challenges remain. Battery technology still limits the range of flying taxis, and weather conditions in Africa can ground even the most advanced aircraft. Public acceptance, though promising, will need time to mature, and the cost, while cheaper than helicopters, is still high for the average citizen. But these challenges do not erase the achievement, they simply set the agenda for what comes next. In the political imagination of Africa, Rwanda's flight and Burkina Faso's reforms are part of the same chapter. One nation lifted its people into the skies, another lifted its sovereignty out of the shadows of foreign control. Together, they remind the continent that innovation is not just about machines, but about courage. While applause echoed in Kigali boardrooms in Washington, Brussels, and Beijing buzzed with a different kind of energy, Rwanda's flying taxi demonstration was not just a technological event, it was a geopolitical signal. The sight of an African nation leading in advanced aviation forced the world to confront a question it was unprepared for: what happens when Africa is no longer behind but ahead? From the American perspective, the moment was unsettling. For decades, the United States has branded itself as the global leader in aviation innovation. Yet, while the Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) is still entangled in debates about how to regulate small delivery drones, Rwanda has already normalized autonomous aircraft and advanced to passenger-carrying flights. U.S. media coverage of the event was cautious, often framing it as a Chinese-backed project rather than an African achievement. Behind that language lay a quiet concern: if nations like Rwanda can implement technology faster, what does that mean for America's dominance in innovation? Europe's reaction mirrored this unease. Germany and France, both proud of their engineering heritage, were confronted with the reality that their lengthy regulatory processes might now be liabilities. European commentators noted that while Brussels debates safety protocols, Kigali is busy rewriting the rules of mobility. Some voices in the EU praised Rwanda's agility, while others warned of risk-taking. But the truth was clear: the continent they once dismissed as a follower was now setting precedents. China's reaction was different. For Beijing, the Kigali demonstration was a triumph of partnership. The E-Hang A216s came from a Chinese manufacturer, and the test flight symbolized more than aviation. It showcased China's expanding influence in Africa's future industries. Unlike Western powers, which often see Africa through the lens of aid and dependency, China saw Rwanda as a testing ground and partner. By placing advanced aviation in Kigali, Beijing signaled that Africa is not just a market for finished products, but a stage for pioneering innovation. But perhaps the most profound response came from within Africa itself. Leaders across the continent drew inspiration, seeing Rwanda's achievement as a proof of concept for leapfrogging. Among them, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso stood out. His government's moves to nationalize gold, invest in indigenous technology, and resist external pressures resonated with Rwanda's bold step into aviation. Together, these examples fueled a broader African narrative that sovereignty in the 21st century is not only about controlling borders and resources, but also about mastering the future of technology. For many in the African diaspora, particularly in the United States, the Kigali flight sparked pride and reflection. Could Africa finally break free of the narrative that innovation flows only from the West? Could leaders like Traore and Kagame show that boldness, not wealth, is the key to leadership? These questions began to surface in community forums, academic debates, and even policy circles. The broader world now faces a new reality. Africa is no longer a passive stage for outside powers. Whether in Ouagadougou or Kigali, nations are charting their own course. For the United States, the challenge is whether it can respect and support this autonomy, or whether it will respond with skepticism and resistance. For China, the question is how far its partnerships can go without repeating patterns of dependency. What is undeniable is that Rwanda's taxi in the sky was more than a flight. It was a message that the global balance of innovation is shifting, and Africa is not waiting for anyone to catch up. As the dust settled in Kigali after the flying taxi touched down, one truth lingered in the minds of those who witnessed it: the world can no longer afford to underestimate Africa. Rwanda's test flight was not just a dazzling display of engineering. It was a glimpse into a future where African nations seize the initiative, take risks, and lead. But that future comes with both promise and warning. The promise is clear. Flying taxis could change how millions live, work, and connect. They could save lives in medical emergencies, connect rural farmers to urban markets, and make Africa's sprawling megacities more livable. Coupled with visionary leadership, the continent has a chance to bypass decades of slow, expensive infrastructure projects and leap directly into a three-dimensional transportation age. The warning, however, is just as real. Innovation is never neutral. The same skies that carry Rwanda's flying taxis could one day be filled with surveillance drones or foreign-controlled aircraft if African nations fail to secure their autonomy. Technology without sovereignty risks becoming another form of dependency. This is why leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso matter in the story. While Rwanda pioneers, Aviation Traoré is ensuring that Africa's resources, industries, and policies remain firmly in African hands. Together, their approaches highlight the need for balanced progress must walk hand in hand with independence. The global context cannot be ignored. Western powers are watching nervously, often dismissing African achievements as experimental. China sees opportunity embedding itself in Africa's future industries. But the ultimate question is not about Washington or Beijing. It is about whether Africans themselves will control this new era, whether the future skies belong to Africa or to those who once dictated its destiny. And that is where you, the viewer, come in. Rwanda's flying taxi is more than an African story. It is a human story, a reminder that courage can rewrite history. But courage requires support. Do you believe nations like Rwanda and leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are building the foundations of a truly sovereign Africa? Or do you fear that the same old powers will find new ways to hold the continent back? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you ride in a self-flying taxi? Do you think Traoré's bold strategies can protect Africa's sovereignty as technology races ahead? If you feel Africa deserves to lead in both innovation and independence, share this video. And if you believe that the truth about Africa's future is more important than yesterday's headlines, don't just watch, subscribe so you are part of the journey as this story unfolds. Because yesterday, Africa touched the skies. Tomorrow, with leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, it might just own them.